We as people love quotes. We have an interest for the words of others, often fixating on them, repeating them, or in some cases, even applying them to our own lives. We as people love to misinterpret or misuse quotes, or use them to justify our own actions or ways of thinking. But of all the words people say throughout their lives, oftentimes their most memorable words were their last ones. We are fascinated with people's final words, often attributing a great deal of meaning to them, memorializing them, or using them as a lens by which we can define the character of the person who said them. Take, for example, Alexander the Great, who died at age 33 from an illness or possibly poisoning. On his deathbed, the sickly, delirious Alexander allegedly called out, "To the strongest." What these words meant was and has been debated ever since. Those in the room with Alexander evidently believed this was in reference to who should succeed him as ruler of his mighty kingdom, as in, it should go to whoever was the strongest. Is that really what Alexander meant, or was he simply muttering nonsense while his body was ravaged by fever? In any case, his kingdom did not go to the strongest, as no one could really decide who the strongest was, and rather than unifying after Alexander's death and solidifying the empire he had conquered, his friends and generals went their separate ways, claiming chunks of Alexander's kingdom as their own, and then going to war with each other. Tens of thousands would die in the following years as Alexander's empire turned to a battlefield in the wake of his death. All of this possibly as a result of the 3 words spoken with his last breath of life, "To the strongest." The quote has also been widely used to derive much about Alexander's own character, both good and bad. Some have argued that his last words were a testament to his narcissism and selfishness, implying that he said those words because he simply didn't care what happened to his realm when he was dead. Others have argued that there was more sense in his words, and that he knew the empire he had built was one built largely on his personality, and without him, only the strongest would be able to maintain it. Others have suggested that it never really happened at all, and that the words attributed to Alexander's last were invented and simply used as an explanation for the decades of war and instability that followed. In a very unique way, Alexander the Great's last words also serve to honor his memory. For although his empire crumbled into violence and chaos only a few years after his death, it was he, Alexander, that ordered it. He had granted his realm to the strongest, and so the strongest had fought. It may have destroyed all that he had built, but in the end, Alexander's last words were honored. These are the final words of some of history's most notable figures. This is the retelling. Among the most famous last words in history come from ancient Rome. On the Ides of March 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators that opposed his unprecedented way of ruling. Among the assassins was Caesar's own friend, pupil, and possible son, Brutus. As Caesar recoiled from his attackers, he fought back as best as he could, but he was surrounded. Then he saw Brutus, and he gave up the fight. Recognizing his friend among the assassins, Caesar said, "Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus?" Then, slumping to the floor, betrayed and mortally wounded, Caesar pulled his toga over his face, and he died. Et tu, Brute, are among the most recognizable last words in all of history, and yet those are not the words Caesar allegedly said as he died. While not far off, what he actually said, according to Roman historians, was, "You too, child?" Either that, or he said nothing at all. Et tu, Brute was immortalized by William Shakespeare, who featured the line in his play Julius Caesar in the year 1599. Oddly enough, even in that play, Et tu, Brute, are not Caesar's last words. His next utterance, then fall, Caesar, are his final lines in Shakespeare. Caesar had completely changed the social and political order of Rome, and when he died, he left the Republic a broken and shattering system that would have to fight years of civil war before again achieving some level of stability. In the end, the man who came out on top of this conflict, and the man who actually founded the Roman Empire, was Caesar's own nephew, Augustus. Augustus was in many ways the perfect emperor. In addition to having the longest reign of any Roman emperor, he was also a master administrator, politician, and ruler. From the chaos left in the wake of Caesar's death, Augustus not only managed to stabilize things, he also founded the Roman Empire itself. He had inherited an old, broken republic, racked with civil war and uncertainty, and by the time of his death 40 years later, he had remade Rome into an empire and into the indomitable force that would go on to conquer so much of the world. Augustus solidified the empire, maneuvered through political machinations, and even managed to ensure a peaceful transition of power would take place after his death. Augustus had inherited a disaster, and he left behind an empire. He had done his job, and he had done it well. He had played his part. His famous last words very much capture this. Old and feeble, with wrinkled skin and missing teeth, the once perfect emperor lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his friends and family, and he said, "Have I played my part well? Then applaud as I exit." Then he died. The date was the 19th of August, 14 AD. Rome thought Augustus had indeed played his part well, and they did more than simply applaud him as he exited this life. They also made him a god. In the year 68 AD, the Emperor Nero was ousted by the Senate and declared a public enemy of Rome. In a matter of days, he had gone from the most powerful man in the world to a hunted fugitive on the run for his life. Nero was a bad man and a bad emperor. He was an eccentric, sadistic tyrant who murdered his own family members, spent money wildly, and persecuted everyone he didn't like, from early Christians to powerful senators. He was also widely blamed for the Great Fire that had destroyed much of the city of Rome in 64. By the time he was declared a public enemy, Nero had very few friends he could turn to for support. With the Praetorian Guard having abandoned him and his household servants leaving him as well, Nero quickly learned that all of Rome had abandoned him. Walking the halls of his empty palace, Nero called for his friends and servants, but none of them came. Realizing how grim his situation had really become, Nero contemplated his options. He had lost his power, and his enemies were closing in on him. Escape was unlikely, if not impossible, and there was no longer any chance of negotiating his way out of this. If his enemies captured him, he would be subjected to a terrible death. In the end, Nero decided to take his fate into his own hands and fall on his sword. Sort of. Instead, he called for a gladiator to be summoned and to do the job for him, but none came. Powerless to the point where even his servants ignored him, Nero was despondent. Fleeing his palace disguised as a servant, Nero then rode to the nearby villa of a freedman called Phaon. There, Nero paced the halls, putting off the inevitable. He knew there was no way out. He had been declared an enemy of Rome. Soldiers were at that very moment on their way to apprehend him, and subject him to a terrible fate. There was only one thing left to do. Holding a dagger to his body, Nero nervously paced the halls of Phaon's villa, muttering to himself over and over, "What an artist the world is losing! What an artist dies in me!" He couldn't believe the world would want to be rid of him. In the end, Nero couldn't do it. He couldn't end his own life, and so he asked for assistance. He wanted to see it done, and asked one of his attendants to show him the best way to fall on their sword, but unsurprisingly none of them volunteered. Nero hesitated. What an artist the world is losing. Holding the blade close, Nero paced the halls and waited anxiously. Then he heard the sound of approaching soldiers, the ones who had come to arrest him, and he knew he had run out of time. Still, he was unable to do it himself. As the soldiers surrounded the villa and began banging on the doors, Nero finally forced his personal secretary to help him cut his own throat. What an artist the world is losing. As soldiers entered the villa to arrest the former emperor, they found him already dying, drowning on his own blood. There is some conjecture as to what Nero meant by his repetitive ramblings, "What an artist the world is losing." Did he literally mean artist? He may have. Nero loved to perform, seeing himself as an actor and a musician, but he may also have been referring to architecture and his great plans for construction and for further development. In any case, it doesn't matter. What an artist the world is losing were not Nero's final words, despite often being quoted as such. His actual final words were said to the soldiers who came to arrest him. As one of the soldiers knelt to stop the bleeding, Nero said to him, "Too late. This is fidelity," or "This is loyalty," in reference to the secretary that had helped him cut his own throat. Nero died on the 9th of June, 68 AD. Now let's move on from Roman emperors to the victims of Roman emperors. In August of the year 258 AD, the Roman Emperor Valerian declared that all Christian priests, bishops, and deacons be immediately arrested and executed, and that much of the wealth collected by the Church should be turned over to the Roman state. The Roman Empire was in crisis. Invasions, economic decline, and an internal instability had weakened the mighty empire. At the heart of that internal instability was the growing religious group called the Christians. Rome's state religion had always been closely tied to the stability of the empire. It was the people's duty to serve and honor the gods so that the empire could continue to grow and prosper. The Christians, however, with their new and growing religion, didn't recognize the Roman pantheon, and thus, from the emperor's point of view, they were a threat to the empire. On the emperor's orders, many prominent Christians were immediately arrested and put to death, including Pope Sixtus II, who was arrested in Rome on the 6th of August, 258, and promptly executed. Among the other Christians persecuted was the Pope's close friend and a prominent deacon in the early church, a man called Lawrence. As deacon of Rome, Lawrence was an important figure in the Christian community. He was responsible for the church's material possessions and its treasures, as well as distributing alms to the poor. In other words, he was the man with the money. After the Pope had been executed, the emperor's soldiers detained Lawrence, and he was brought before a Roman prefect, who ordered him to turn over all of the church's treasures to the Roman state. This would have been no small sum of money and treasure. Lawrence agreed to the demand, but asked for more time, requesting 3 days to gather up the church's wealth. His request was granted. Lawrence went to work immediately, gathering up all the treasures and material possessions of the church, but not so he could hand them over to the emperor and the Roman state, but instead so that he could distribute them to the poor and needy citizens of the struggling empire. For 3 days, Lawrence worked tirelessly to distribute the church's wealth, handing out treasures to the poor, the blind, the sick, and the crippled, so that by the 3rd day, little to nothing remained for Emperor Valerian. Appearing again before the Roman prefect, this time with a procession of the dispossessed at his back, Lawrence was ordered to turn over the wealth he'd collected over the 3 days. Gesturing to the procession of the dispossessed beggars, the blind, the poor, and the suffering, Lawrence said, "Here are the treasures of the church." For his insult and his insubordination, Lawrence was arrested and sentenced to a brutal execution. He was to be roasted alive on a gridiron. He was martyred on the 10th of August, 258, and was later canonized as Saint Lawrence. According to tradition, his last words as he was being roasted alive were, "Turn me over. I'm done on this side." He is the patron saint of comedians. Last words can sometimes capture a person's character and ideals with only a few words, and perhaps the best to ever do it was one of the most famous writers and wits of all time, Voltaire. A lifelong enemy of the Catholic Church, the French writer, philosopher, and poet Voltaire had spent his life like an 18th century influencer, writing letters and books, spreading new thought and philosophy across Enlightenment Europe, and rubbing shoulders with some of the most important people on the continent. While not an atheist, Voltaire's views on organized religion and more specifically, organized Christianity were bold and radical for the time. He saw organized Christianity as oppressive and a constant source of superstition. He did not believe in religious dogma, miracles, or stories of divine intervention. Voltaire was a man who unapologetically believed what he believed, even at the cost of friendships, and even at the very end of his own life. On May 30th, 1778, Voltaire died at the age of 83. According to one source, when a priest asked Voltaire to renounce Satan, the aged philosopher replied, "My good man, this is no time to make new enemies." Not everyone's last words are so memorable as Voltaire's. Take, for example, the last words of Ulysses S. Grant, who died from throat cancer on the 23rd of July, 1885, at the age of 63. His last utterance, while not very memorable, are perhaps the most common last words spoken throughout all of human history. He said simply, "Water." Perhaps we as people put too much weight on quotes, especially when they are someone's final words. We attribute some serious meaning to them, like they mean more than all the other words that were ever said or written by that person. Maybe we fear being forgotten, or maybe we desire a quotable legacy. On the 20th of July, 1923, Pancho Villa was riding in a car through Parral, Chihuahua, when he was suddenly ambushed by a group of gunmen. As bullets tore through the car, killing Pancho Villa and his bodyguards, Villa allegedly said, "Don't let it end like this. Tell them I said something." Then he died. But did he really say this? Of the 5 people with Pancho Villa that day, only one of them, Ramon Contreras, survived, managing to kill one of the assassins before escaping the ambush badly wounded. He is the only source of Villa's last words. In reality, Pancho Villa was likely killed instantly. with over 40 rounds having been fired into his car, with several of them striking Villa in the head and chest, it's likely that he spoke no words at all. But still, there is the myth and the meaning of his last words. Perhaps we put too much stock in last words of individuals. Perhaps we attribute too much to their last words and not enough to everything else they said. So on that thought, to conclude this video, I'll leave you with the last words of Karl Marx. Last words are for fools who haven't said enough.